Thanks everyone for being here in the, coincidentally, the Illumina auditorium here. Welcome. Welcome to your auditorium.
Thanks, sign went up today, you said, right?
That's right.
Just in time.
Just in time. This is our first big event here. I want to begin by thanking our CFO committee and the folks who put together the first in our series of fireside chats here tonight. I'm going to introduce our guest in a minute, but I think he probably doesn't need an introduction. Everyone knows Jay and has followed Jay's incredible success here, but we'll get to the introduction of Jay in a minute. Let me thank Dan Kleberg and Ernst & Young, Mike Milligan and Barney & Barney, Hugh Sanborn and Oxford Finance, and Mike White and Silicon Valley Bank. We really appreciate all of your support for helping us put this together tonight. And then to take a step forward to our next fireside chat, I'm really pleased to announce also that our next speaker series is going to feature Hans Bishop, who's President and CEO of Juno Therapeutics, and we'll have an update by the end of the month and a date for that event. So please keep on checking back because there are a number of other events that we'll have going on here at this new facility that we really intend to make for all of you a life science community facility where we can all come together and do what we do best here in the San Diego region, and that's network and find ways that we can work together and learn from each other. So we're with the CEO of the global sequencing powerhouse based here in San Diego, Jay Flatley of Illumina. And we're going to explore a lot in our conversation that takes us back to the past and the beginnings of Illumina, where Illumina is today, and what we can look forward to in the future, and also get some perspective from Jay on his experience in getting the company started in its early days and how he's maintained the culture that he's maintained, the culture of success at Illumina. Also, throughout this presentation, I'm going to take a few breaks, and Jay and I have decided that we're going to give you a chance to ask questions as we go from the past to the present to the future. And we'll probably also throw in a few questions that a few more intriguing questions in the sequencing arena that we'll ask you to give us some perspective on as well. So to introduce Jay, you've been the CEO at Illumina since 1999.
October 99, yep.
October 99, you've got great experience going back to molecular dynamics and other companies, including computing companies that you've worked with in the past. You've interestingly got a BA degree in economics that you got at Claremont McKenna,
right.
And then your master's in industrial engineering at Stanford, and just an incredible background building Illumina here in San Diego. You know, the other thing I want to say is that from the time that I came to Biocom back in 1999, I've really appreciated the time that you've taken to sit down with me over the years, time and time again, to get a little bit of a briefing from you each time on the progress of the company and the planning for the company, and it's just been great to sit down with you over time. And thanks for your leadership in the industry here. Thanks for your support of Biocom. And I think, you know, when I think of you, I think of your leadership by example here and the success you've had and some of the things that you've done that have been really courageous in the face of some real challenges that you've had. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I know you want to talk about that as well.
Great.
So,
well, thanks for that generous introduction, and maybe I can thank you and Biocom and Alexandria as well for putting this on and inviting me to talk about my favorite subject, which is fantastic, and welcome, and thanks to all of you for coming to join us tonight. So saw a lot of familiar faces in the few minutes I was upstairs, so thanks again.
So let's go down memory lane. Let's go back to 1999. I think it's probably fair to say that when you came to Illumina in 1999, it was a much different company than what it is today. I remember things like microarrays and how many microarray plates can you fit on a dish, and SNP sequencing and protein expression and some of the early stage things that you did. But when you came, what were you thinking about? What was your vision for what Illumina could become way back in 1999?
Well, when I got there were about 25 people in the company, so the company had really about a year old, had secured some of the core intellectual property from Tufts to build a new generation of microarrays. And as many of you who sort of followed that field, at that time, Affymetrix was the 800-pound gorilla in the microarray business. They had a technology called a gene chip, and they used semiconductor processing to make those gene chips. And so when I came out of Molecular Dynamics, I had sold that company in 1998. Molecular Dynamics had been involved in the microarray business and the DNA sequencing business. In fact, we built the first 50 scanners for Affymetrix because they didn't have a scanner technology. So that happened about 1995 or so. So we kind of enabled the startup of Affymetrix, and then we launched the first capillary DNA sequencer. So I had arrays and sequencing in my background when I got to Illumina. And after I sold Molecular Dynamics, I was looking for the next great startup, and Illumina was it. My wife and I agreed to come to San Diego on a 5-year plan, and here we are, 15 years later, 17 years later, whatever it is. It speaks to the greatness of San Diego. But the mission of the company really then was to understand how we could take that microarray technology and really develop a new generation that could eclipse Affymetrix. And go into multiple applications, expression, genotyping, and potentially proteomics. And we worked hard on proteomics and actually never launched a product in proteomics. So there's a story to be told there if anybody cares about that story. But we had ambitions in the long run to get into sequencing, but we didn't have a sequencing technology in those early days.
So what led to that? I mean, was your, back then, 1999, 2000, Craig Venter and Francis Collins sequenced the human genome.
Right.
I remember they had literally hundreds and hundreds of sequencers in 2 different locations that they used over, 7 or 8 years to be able to accomplish that. Did you have any inkling of a vision at that time about high-speed sequencing and Illumina moving into that arena?
Well, yeah, I did and we did, because I was involved in that in a different way than Craig was. Craig was actually doing the sequencing, and at Molecular Dynamics, I was in the same kind of role that I am now. So Molecular Dynamics built the first capillary sequencer that wound up sequencing about 1/3 of the human genome program. Celera, where Craig was, because they were tied directly to ABI, they used 3700, which was ABI's competitive product. They launched about a year later than we did, but they had a much bigger market footprint and much better control over reagents, so they eclipsed what we had launched in the market. So about 2/3 of it was done on their technology, about 1/3 on Molecular Dynamics technology. And then after I sold it to Amersham, they never invested in that, so it kind of disappeared. But I always had an affection for sequencing and had an intent to try to drive Illumina in that direction. But as I said, we didn't have a way to do that at that point in time. So we explored all kinds of things over the years and wound up, via acquisition, getting into sequencing.
And your plan at that time was to get into sequencing in a way that you would lead the industry in the sequencing arena. And from there, did you see your expansion as being a U.S. expansion, or were you thinking globally back then, or not?
The company was thinking globally from the very beginning. I had been in my prior companies. We had a global distribution team, and so we knew how to market around the world, and that was the plan all along at Illumina. So that really wasn't a differentiating factor at all. U.S. clearly was the bigger market and the early adopter part of the market, but it was very clear that if we could come up with a sequencing technology, that it would have universal appeal.
And so from the beginning, was your plan to continue to grow the company? Did you have any thoughts of acquisition or merger or anything along those lines? Or what was your thinking in terms of where you wanted the company to go down the road?
Yeah, well, we always said internally that we were running Illumina to be a large standalone company. And I think to be successful, you sort of have to take that view. And it's what allowed us to take appropriate risks and to think big about both our opportunity and our decision-making process. If you're running it to be acquired, you do things that are suboptimal if you're really trying to be a standalone company. You invest less in R&D, and you try to drive more to the bottom line, perhaps earlier than we did. So we were always running it that way. But having said that, we were actually thinking that we would become acquired. So early on in our history, people probably don't remember this, but we had a partnership with Applied Biosystems. So I came in October '99, and the acting CEO had been negotiating a deal with Applied Biosystems, who was my arch enemy back at Molecular Dynamics. And so I came in, and about 2 weeks later, on my birthday, signed that agreement with Applied Biosystems. But that agreement wound up blowing up 2 or 3 years later. But we always were planning to run it as a standalone company, but we thought we would probably get acquired, and ABI was a logical acquirer. Affymetrix, in fact, was a logical acquirer because we thought, we definitely had a next generation technology, but only a fraction of the resources and a zero market footprint compared to Affymetrix. So we always thought they might acquire us. But interestingly, in our history, I get asked this a lot by investors, how many offers have you had that you've turned down? And the answer is one. I mean, it only happened once for us. So nobody else really tried to acquire us in our history. And we've often asked ourselves why that was, because that's atypical, I think. And the answer, I think, at least the best answer I can give to that question, is that we were, for many years after we went public in 2000, very quietly developing a product that we launched in 2003. And everybody thought Affymetrix was going to be the winner and that we really couldn't compete with them. And it took a couple years before we showed that we could. And once we did, we exploded into the market at such a velocity, and our stock went up so fast that we went from being something that nobody had interest in acquiring to a company whose valuation was quite high and whose multiple was quite high. And so we passed through that sort of acquisition region pretty quickly. And I had a friend, actually somebody who came to work for us, who worked for GE. He ran business development for GE. And I asked him, did GE ever think about acquiring Illumina? And he said, yeah, we did. And my job was to prepare the slide deck that we present to the executives at GE. And they wanted them ranked in stock multiple. And so you were number 100, and we never got to that slide ever. there was no year we ever got to the Illumina slide when we reviewed the deck. And so that was probably part of the problem.
So you expected to be acquired from the beginning. You passed through that stage where your multiple was so high that you really weren't attractive. But then you had this little incident with a company called Roche a few years ago that, as I recall, came in and made you an offer of about $40 a share, and you turned it down.
Right.
Right? And when I think of all of the merger and acquisition that I've seen in San Diego, I don't think I can think of an example that's similar to what you were able to do. A lot of the time, of course, what happens is the offer comes in and you've got investors who have been in for a long time. They see it as an attractive offer. Venture folks, they want out and they take the deal.
Yeah.
You held out and you had a board, and maybe you can talk a little bit about your board that
Sure.
backed you up. But that was a huge company coming after you and making you an offer. And I'd love to hear,
Yeah.
I think we'd all love to hear a little bit more about what you went through and how you were successful. And I mean, what are you trading at today?
Today, 218.
218. So that's a little better than $40
A little
a share.
better, yeah. Yeah. Well, that whole episode was precipitated by a collapse in our stock price that happened in the third quarter of 2011. We were trading, I think it was in the 60s or low 70s. And then if you remember back in that time, there was sequestration. So NIH funding everybody thought was going to zero, and Europe was falling apart. At the same time, we happened a quarter before that to introduce a new reagent kit to the market that tripled the output of our installed base. So it was a phenomenal improvement in sequencing technology. But it had the knock-on effect of essentially increasing the capacity of the installed base in a way where people slowed down their purchases of new machines. And we'll come back to that to talk about whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, because we've done lots of post-analysis on that decision. But our stock dropped from that 60s to low 70s down to about $24 a share. And that happened in the course of a couple months. And so that's what precipitated Roche coming after us. And I got a call from the CEO of Roche, and he said, we'd like to have a meeting with you and your chairman. We did that at Bill Rastetter's house down at the beach. It lasted about 40 minutes, and about 3 minutes into it, he said, well, we're going to acquire your company. And I said, really? I mean, literally, it was about 10 minutes of small talk, 3 minutes into the meeting, we're going to acquire your company, and we'd rather do it in a friendly way than an unfriendly way. And so we spent the next 10 minutes sort of talking about what they had in mind and what their structure was. And this was sort of middle of December, and by January, so over Christmas, we worked very hard to agree that we didn't like the offer that they had given us privately. And the board I called them up and I said, we're not going to take the offer. And by about January 24th, they went hostile. publicly. And that's where we got the $40 offer publicly. And the interesting part of this story is that we didn't have any venture capitalists on the board, so we had long been public, and so they were fleshed out. And we had a great group of long-term investors who believed in our ability to continue to innovate, as well as what we call the unbounded market opportunity that we have. And it's not just us, it's sequencing in general. And because people saw that unbounded market opportunity, they were very much in our camp in terms of sort of defending the position that management had on this. So they bid against themselves publicly a couple of different times and got up to, I think the last public offer was about $51 a share. And we turned it down again without giving them any number that we wanted. So we never said, we'll take X. And so they had to keep bidding against themselves in the public market because they had gone hostile. And so by the time it got to the third point, they drew a line and said, look, we can't do this publicly anymore. We went to the annual meeting. The vote was about 90% in our favor, about 6% in their favor. So we won that handily. And for the next year, there were a bunch of backdoor conversations that very few people know about, where they came at us in a bunch of different ways, saying, well, could we buy 55%? Could we be your exclusive IVD partner? Could we do all these other things? And we continued to say no. One really important factor for us was that we do a rigorous strategic planning effort in our company every year, and it finishes in January. So at the time they came hostile, we had a perfectly fresh 3-year strategic plan that allowed us to create a very strong case to our shareholders that we could grow much faster and that their value creation opportunity was much greater with us remaining independent than being sold to Roche.
So did you ever have a target price in mind, or was it more a matter of you're looking at your 3-year strategic plan and saying, no, we've got things to do, we're not interested?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You know, I thought I had experienced everything possible in my career, but I'd never been through a hostile takeover before. And one of the rules you learn quickly there is that among the board members, you can't really have that conversation because everything that happens in that process becomes disclosable. And so everybody had their own idea in their head of what they might take, but we never sat down as a group and said we would take this number. And to this day, that number's never been formulated, and we obviously never gave it to Roche.
And some people have said Roche never goes away. Have they gone away, or do you think they're still out there?
Hard to know, right? I mean, they're kind of buying up everything around us. So I think their strategy has changed from buying the leader in sequencing to buying all the applications and the distribution channel. They're trying to surround what we do now. So it's interesting to watch their steps here in what they're trying to accomplish. But you know, I think never did the board waver, never did our shareholders waver, at least anywhere near the prices that Roche was talking about.
And everyone's benefit. I mean, we'll talk more about where you are now, but I think we'll open it up for a few questions, if that's okay with you.
It was very clear to Roche that we had the winning sequencing technology. They are the only company where our technology was applicable in all 3 of their businesses. So they had a life sciences business, and we were the leader. And so they would have dominated sequencing in life sciences, and they had a technology called 454 that was dying off in the marketplace. So they had to somehow reinforce that. They had the right vision that sequencing was going to be very, very important in diagnostics, and that the clinical application of this was really going to be the long-term driver. And in fact, it's interesting because they had to go out on their roadshow to convince our shareholders to sell their shares and make this sort of challenging proposition to them that this company is really valuable and we want to offer this number, but it's not that valuable really, you know, to try to keep that number contained. And to their shareholders, they had to say, you know, our price is a good one. So they were sort of compromised in how they had to present that. And the third business they're in is therapeutics, and sequencing is incredibly valuable now in therapeutic development. So our technology would have given them a massive leverage across all 3 of their businesses. We've had 3 separate development programs in cut bait 3 separate times. So we started out working on that in parallel with genotyping and expression, and genotyping advanced much more quickly than in proteomics. And the target at that time that I set for our team was develop a highly specific 100 multiplex protein assay, and we might have something we could market, and we couldn't get close. So we did okay, maybe at 10 or 16 multiplex, but because proteins are so sticky and so non-specific, we couldn't develop a general purpose assay that got to 100. We then thought about 5 years later that we had discovered the keys to the kingdom, and we bought a company that had a special technology for sorting out proteins and testing against the specificity. It's like an aptamer, but slightly different technology than an aptamer. And we bought that company thinking we could get it to market, and by then the challenge was build a 1,000-plex assay, and we couldn't get close. So we've started and stopped a couple different times, and it really has to do with how much you can charge and how many different data points you can get out at once, and we never could hit the thresholds. Well, the process was quite interesting because the first thing we had to do, of course, is hire bankers, and then we went through a very intense, it was about a 3-week process where you have to file a document in response, a public document. That was 24/7. I did nothing else during that time. And it was interesting when we hired Goldman Sachs and Bank of America as our advisors, and they had defended a couple other companies that Roche had bought, but Roche had been successful ultimately in those deals. But Goldman and Bank of America knew them very, very well and knew every step they were going to take, and we were watching the playbook just come at us in the same fashion. So I did nothing else until we filed that document. Our bankers told us that this was just a matter of price. And so your bankers are telling you you're going to get acquired, and Roche doesn't give up. It's just a matter of price. And so even they were wrong about that. And we thought we were going to be acquired. We thought they would just keep going up until we hit some price that the shareholders would sell. I think the strategic miss they had was that they started too low initially. Had they started $10 or $15 higher, they could have got away probably with bidding against themselves only twice and wouldn't have had to go to that third one and probably would have gotten it. So, had they gone to $75 or $80, it probably would have been tough for us to hold off the shareholders at that kind of price point. After we filed that document, it took probably 10% of my time after that. It was interesting that their playbook is so explicit in how they do this that the day they went public, there was a posting for all our employees about the Welcome to Roche website. So they literally, they had a landing page for our employees to go learn about Roche and what they're going to do. And they said publicly, we're going to move all these people to San Diego, and it's going to be under our leadership. So people in their European operation, the first day, were told they were going to move to San Diego. They thought this was a done deal. It's really remarkable.
They probably never run into anyone or anything like this before.
Maybe not. I don't know.
Right?
That's amazing. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. So back at that point in time, some of you may remember, sequencing was a highly competitive business. So we were competing against Life Technologies. They had the solid product, and we had our HiSeqs. And it was kind of a race in the marketplace for who had the highest throughput, who could offer sequencing at a cheaper price. And we were constantly leapfrogging each other in the market. And so every quarter, every 2 quarters, we were announcing new technology, new reagents. And we had this gigantic leap that we thought would have a big impact. It had the negative impact that I talked about before in terms of people stopping buying sequencers at the same rate. But the positive impact was that it was such a big leap that it knocked out the competition. So that was kind of the death of solid. Once we launched that factor of 3, they just couldn't keep up. So in the long run, it probably was the right call, but it was a tough couple of quarters right after that. And then the instrument business came back because we enabled new markets again, and the sample flow got reestablished. You can imagine these customers who are using our systems, if all of a sudden your sample throughput triples, you have to go find more samples. And it took people a couple quarters to reestablish their sample pipelines and to buy enough reagents to fill up the machines.
You must have the most loyal set of shareholders on the planet by now, Jay.
They're pretty good shareholders. They really are. Yeah, we have fantastic shareholders at the top. They all believe in the long-term future of sequencing and where it's going and all the brand new exciting applications. So yes, we do.
What percentage of institutional now?
Oh, it's the vast majority. It's probably 85 or 90%.
They must be happy because someone gave me a calculation here that's mind-boggling. And maybe you can tell me if this is accurate, but 100,000 invested in Illumina in 2003 would today be worth $46,029,629. That's happy shareholders.
Yeah. I wish I had bought more. Right.
I wish I had too.
Well, I mean, that's interesting because we went public in 2000. I came in October. By December, because the market was just on fire, as we all remember, in '99 and early 2000, and we decided we got to take the company public. And we were 40 people. We had no product, but we raised $100 million. We filed 2 days after that famous Clinton Blair speech that tipped over the marketplace. And Goldman was very conservative. They're a conservative bank, and so between the time we filed, they kept saying, well, we need to hold, we're not ready to go, we got to wait for the market to turn around, and it kept drifting down and drifting down. Sequinome had done 2 offerings in that time, so you guys are doing great. And so I finally said in July, I said to Goldman, we're either going with you or without you. And they said, okay. And so we went, raised $100 million. And then the stock went from 16 to 56 in a matter of about 2 months. And then we started drifting down like the rest of the market, but we were kind of above the rest of it. We were drifting down, but at a slower rate. We got down to $2 a share in about 2001, something like that. And people from the outside looking in said, oh, those were the dark days of Illumina. But the fact of the matter was we were just marching on our development plan, meeting our milestones. We had $100 million, and we were just very focused on making our product. And at that point, the employees didn't care so much about the stock because they were all looking at the long term. And that was a pre-split price, in fact, so it was equivalent of $1 a share. So, yeah, had we bought 1 million shares back then, I might be retired.
So let's stay on that theme. So I think your sales are, what, about 1.8 billion, something?
That was last year. So 2.23 billion is the analyst numbers for this year.
And I think about a year ago, you made a prediction that the overall market for sequencing was somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 billion, but I think you more recently said that that's way too small. So first question for you is, where do you think it's going numbers-wise?
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, I don't see anyone as your competition right now. It looks like the sky's the limit for Illumina. Love to get your perspective on where you think things are going.
Sure, yeah. So at our Analyst Day a year ago, January, we did a very broad perspective of what we thought of the market. At that point in time, we said there's a $20 billion TAM in sequencing, total addressable market. The reason we've said recently that that number is probably conservative, and our analysts do as well, is because it didn't include a whole host of things that just 18 months later are absolutely clear are going to be big incremental contributors to that market. And that has to do with average risk in non-invasive prenatal testing, which wasn't in that number, and we can go back and talk about NIPT if people want to. Probably the most important market it doesn't include is what today is generally being referred to as liquid biopsy. So the ability to sequence your blood and to detect cancer DNA in your blood. And this is broadly applicable, is going to be an absolutely gigantic market. Will apply initially to diagnosing tumor types. So once someone comes symptomatically to their physician and they get diagnosed with cancer, we'll be able to molecularly characterize that tumor simply through a blood draw. And then it can also be used for monitoring as you start applying therapeutics, for watching the disease go into remission. Can be used to predict recurrence. As you monitor somebody who's been in remission for some time, you can detect recurrence way earlier than you can through any other traditional method, symptoms or imaging. And then the holy grail is screening. So we don't think we're too many years away from the day when in all our physicals you'll have a blood draw that gets sequenced and it'll detect cancer vastly earlier than anyone can do today. So you start adding up those numbers, and we've had analysts come up with numbers of 50 billion.
Wow. And who's your competition?
Life Technologies, now Thermo, is still a little bit of competition in the desktop part of the market. And then there are a lot of startups that are trying to grab some portion of the market, most of them focusing on single molecule sequencing technologies using CMOS, electrical detection. There's a company called Oxford Nanopore that's using nanopore technology to biological nanopores to do sequencing. Those technologies have big challenges. They have some advantages in particular applications, but the fundamental challenge of single molecule is that you can't achieve the kind of accuracies that we achieve, and particularly in the clinical markets, that's absolutely critical. So we're watching, we don't in any way take our competitors lightly, so we're very focused on making sure we understand what they're doing today and what they could do in the future. But we think that most of these single molecule technologies will be niche applications.
I remember once we sat down and I asked you, what's your biggest challenge as CEO? And I think you said something to me to the effect that it was to ensure that your technology was in the forefront and that you were steps ahead of the
That's right.
competitors. And that sounds like it continues to be the focus today.
Yeah, it does. And you know, as we look at the market, you know, there are others that are going to share portions of this market with us. And some of these single molecule technologies have long read advantages, which, you know, for some particular applications are useful. But we have a roadmap that goes out 5 years, and we think the kind of chemistry we use, called single sequencing by synthesis, has a very long life in the marketplace because we've raised the bar to such an extent on accuracy, on throughput levels, on breadth of applications, on software, on cloud analysis capabilities, let alone, you know, a new company having to launch a product into this market has to ultimately become profitable to be sustainable. So they might launch a product for a while, but they actually have to someday make money, or else they're not going to survive. And you know, we make 37% operating profit, so we're over all those thresholds. So it's a very high bar.
Wow. On the back to the sequencing, I think you told me that you've brought the price for institutional full genome sequencing down to about $1,000.
That's right.
But for individual sequencing, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2,900, $3,000.
That's right.
I'm curious, first of all, just to throw it out to the audience, how many people have had themselves fully sequenced in the audience? Just a couple? How many would like to?
Wow,
look at
that's
that.
fantastic. I've got order forms in the car.
Oh, wait, we're not done yet. So how many would pay $2,900? A few, right? How about 2,000? Would you do it for $1,000? I think it sounded like your price point is right,
Yeah.
right
Yeah.
right about there. So you've had yourself sequenced?
Yeah, I was the first one. We were trying to get our lab CLIA certified, and it's this sort of chicken and egg problem because to have it CLIA certified, you have to sequence something to submit to the agencies to get it sequenced. So I was the guinea pig. So I was the first one sequenced with our.
And you found out something unusual but very important, right? About your ability or inability to go under anesthesia, right? So something that was unusual, but you'd certainly want someone to know about that before you go into the operating room, right?
Yeah, I think that story really shows the value of getting sequenced, because when I first got sequenced, there were 10 things that popped out that said I should have been dead already. So this is the value of having this actually done. I put my genome in the public domain, and we went back to what's called HGMD. It's the Human Genome. I forget what it stands for now, actually. But it's got all the variants and the diseases that have been recorded associated with those variants. And it's full of errors. I mean, these are things that, one study done 12 years ago is in this database. And so we were able to go in and, using my genome, begin the correction process to make sure that these databases are much more accurate. And the more genomes we sequence, the more accurate these become. So I wasn't dead, so those 10 didn't matter. And then we detected some autosomal recessive conditions that are asymptomatic for me, so they're things that really don't matter. But then the real value proposition here is that the thing that Joe's talking about here is malignant hypothermia, which we didn't discover the first time I was sequenced. Because our analytics weren't good enough. But once you get sequenced, every year they rerun our new pipelines on the same sequence, and we get better and better and better at analyzing the data. And about 1.5 years ago, they uncovered that I have the most important variant for something called malignant hypothermia. And this is a condition where people die suddenly under anesthesia. And we've all heard of people that sort of mysteriously just suddenly die, having nothing to do with the surgery gone awry, and it's from this condition. And if you know about it, this is fully controllable. So if you see it, you could reverse it while the person's under anesthesia, and there's some anesthetics that are worse than others. So it's the kind of thing that you have to tell your physician, your anesthesiologist, before you go under, and there's no way to know this other than getting sequenced. So it's a perfect example of something being asymptomatic but incredibly valuable.
Do you carry this around on your phone, or is it on a tag?
It's on my iPad.
It's on your, okay.
Yeah,
so-
we've done about 5 revisions of our iPad application called My Genome. So I can scan through my genome right down to the letter, look at the genes, look at the clinical conditions. We now interpret a couple thousand genes in many, many, many hundreds of clinical conditions in the application.
And when you, so folks could come to you now and for $2,900 be sequenced, but you
That's
pair
right.
that up with an analysis and physician advice as well, right?
That's right.
It's not just here's your sequence.
Yes, so for this, we do it as a package, and it requires a physician on the front end and a physician on the back end. So a physician writes a prescription, we do the sequencing, the data are returned to a physician, genetic counselor, and then the individual meets with that genetic counselor to have the interpretation. And this is done to make sure we conform with the FDA rules and to make sure that people were worried about individuals jumping off bridges if they found out something bad in their genome. And so it's to prevent that. So that's bundled into this package. We used to give away an iPad, but now for $2,900, we don't give away the iPad anymore. But the software comes for free. And then you have a clinical interpretation of your genome that gets delivered from the genetic counselor. And that's all bundled. We typically do this through a program we call Understand Your Genome, and we started doing about 3 of these a year. We're now up to about 12 or 14, I think we're going to do this year around the world. So we've done them now all over the world. And we'll do individuals too if they want to be outside that UIG. But that contains a day-and-a-half seminar where you learn a lot about your genome and people who are very educated in how to interpret the genetic information.
Do you think we'll come to a point anytime in the near future when sequencing your genome will be something that'll be reimbursable by insurance?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're working on some programs now with the payers to demonstrate the economic value of sequencing. It's going to start in a couple of targeted markets. So the first one is an area we call rugged, rare undiagnosed disease. And these are kids that wind up in the NICU and often go through hundreds of tests and sometimes years of treatment diagnosis without figuring out what's wrong with them, and only at the very end do they get sequenced. And the hit rate, even these kids that have gone through every other test, depending upon what institution's doing it, is somewhere around 30 to 50% that we can find the specific genetic cause. So this is, if we sequence those kids right at the front end, this is going to save the system enormous amounts of money and the family a lot of stress. These are cases that are not always curable, but you can imagine if you were the parent of a child like this, just having closure that you did everything you could, you now understand what it is, even if you can't treat it, it gives you peace of mind to sort of go on with life for whatever time you have. So really, really important there. I think cancer is the second area where it's going to be absolutely obvious that you ought to get sequenced.
Yeah, this whole area of early stage diagnosis, preventive treatment, I think we're seeing is just beginning to become more appreciated from an economic standpoint.
Right.
And you think about detecting these kinds of things early on and the reduced cost overall to the healthcare system versus the traditional model we have now, right? That's
Exactly right.
wait till it happens, diagnose it, and then treat people for 30 or 40 years down the road.
Yeah, exactly right. And our view is that getting sequenced is a personal choice. There's some people who are dying to get this because they're early adopters and they love to know more about themselves, even if they find things that are not treatable. You have other people who say, I want to only know about things that are potentially actionable in my genome. And then you get others who say, I'm never going to want to do that. Fate will be what it is, and I'll take it when it comes. And so, I think we respect anybody along that spectrum and what decision they make. My wife's an interesting example here because she wanted to get sequenced, and she has a history of Alzheimer's in her family. And so she spent months trying to decide whether she wanted to know about ApoE, which is far and away the most important gene known to be correlated with Alzheimer's disease. And it wasn't until the day before she went into her counselor that she decided she did want to know.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Wow. Probably a good point to stop and take some questions. I'm sure there's a lot of interest in this.
We do. Yeah, so we have special programs for employees. I don't remember all the numbers, but we subsidize, there's a test that one of our customers runs, a company called Foundation Medicine. And for anybody who has cancer, we subsidize that test for them. We also subsidize the whole human genome sequencing for anybody in their family that's diseased, that has a reason to get sequenced. So we reduce the price, I think, about in half. Dana, I don't know if you remember the numbers, but yeah. So we do have a specific program for employees. Huh?
As part of our 21-day engagement.
Yeah.
One of the prizes is
Wow.
All right.
All right. Good deal.
So we were very early on in developing high throughput oligosynthesis technology, which was fundamental to our ability to be economically advantaged in building microarrays and building custom sequencing panels. So we have a great oligosynthesis technology, but it is oriented toward synthesis at the 100 base to 150 base level. Synthesizing genes is tough because you need very accurate DNA synthesis, and there's, for the people who don't know, there's a chemistry that's used to attach base after base after base when you synthesize a synthetic piece of DNA. And there's a non-zero efficiency, less than 100% efficiency in that coupling at the end of that process. And so the longer you go, you exponentially increase your error rate. And so it kind of drops off a cliff once you get much past 100 bases. So it's tough, and a lot of the companies that are focused on this, they make short pieces, and then they have technologies to stitch it together. So Craig has obviously worked on that at his company, and there's many others doing this. I think it's going to have a place in therapeutics, certainly. I mean, that I think is the biggest target. It's not something today, at least, that Illumina participates in. We've talked to some of these companies about whether our synthesis technology would be useful. So far, we've not done any direct work in synthetic biology. Yeah, very, very exciting area. So the microbiome is just now beginning to be sequenceable, meaning that we have enough throughput, cost, and enough ability to decipher the complexity, at least of the human microbiome. The secrets that are being held in the human gut are really going to be incredible once we can unravel them, and we think could be directly related to many of the inflammatory bowel diseases, perhaps to gluten intolerance. There's even been correlations with things like OCD having to do with particular sort of flora in the gut. And so this is really at the very, very earliest stages, but is a particularly exciting area that we and many others are starting to work on. The key answer here is that they don't sequence, they genotype. So they use our array technology, and they look at a very small number of places in the genome, about 400,000. What they deliver has value. It's very interesting stuff, and it's evolved and gotten better over time. And the spots in the genome that they select are the ones that are known to have the most medical relevance. So they intentionally pick those spots in the genome. But doing genotyping, there's lots of things you don't find. You don't find fusions, you don't find insertions, you don't find deletions, you don't find things you don't know to look for. So it's only the things that you know about in advance that you can find through genotyping. So that's why sequencing ultimately will be the way this will be done.
And the next question related to that, when you're talking about the microbiome, I'm familiar with that research.
Mm-hmm.
I already spoke to you a little earlier about macrobiodiversity genomics.
Mm-hmm.
That's starting to become, in a global sense, many institutions are jumping on it, mostly academic and government institutions more than commercial ones. But we're seeing an enormous potential market. It's taxonomy at the beginning,
Right.
But ultimately the dream is you'll have an iPhone and you'll be able to see that butterfly and find some methodology of putting a specimen, and you can actually, at some level, sequence, i.e. to identify its species and genome.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about this effort to build a new molecular taxonomy
Right.
based on the actual sequence, which is a vastly superior way of understanding the heredity of organisms and tracing back in time what the origin was and what the tree looks like for organisms. And we're finding mistakes in the traditional taxonomies. That idea is being extended to diseases as well, because today diseases, we just give them these arbitrary names, and lung cancer versus bladder cancer may be exactly the same thing, but because they've occurred in different tissues, they call them something different. At the molecular level, they may be different, they may be the same, and so I think the science now is working on building a new molecular taxonomy of diseases based on what the molecular profile looks like of those diseases. Sequencing obviously is fundamental to both.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to shift gears one more time.
Okay.
Still in the present, but kind of three different questions really I'd like to talk a little bit about with you. First of all, you've been successful in building the company in San Diego. And San Diego is, I think it's probably fair to say, and Illumina leads the way on this, that San Diego is the global center for sequencing technology. And so I'd like to hear from you a little bit about what makes San Diego unique from an Illumina perspective and being here in Illumina.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we talked a little bit about is you've been incredibly successful at evolving your company culture and yet keeping kind of a consistent focus on the kind of culture that you've wanted at Illumina. And you're up to 4,100 employees, I think,
Right.
today. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then the third thing is I think we've got a lot of young CEOs, new company CEOs, and folks in senior management in the audience here, and a little bit of your perspective for them on and what your principles are in terms of keeping a focus on moving the company forward and maintaining the culture as well. So.
Sure. Well, San Diego obviously is where Illumina was founded. When I came here, there was a quick debate about whether to try to move the company to the Bay Area, and the decision I think was the right one, was to keep it here.
Right.
San Diego is not only the center of sequencing, but a major center in biotech and life sciences, as we all know. The environment here in San Diego is incredibly conducive to companies like ours. We have access to tremendous talent, particularly in the science field here. With the great university programs we have and the other companies that are in this area. I think it's a much more collaborative environment in San Diego business-wise than what I found in my career in the Bay Area, where it was much more competitive, where here I find in sessions like these, people are much more willing to share ideas and to learn from each other, and the kind of institutions that exist to facilitate that are distinct here compared to what I found in the Bay Area. And having said that, San Diego doesn't have some of the kind of resources that we need, and we have to go elsewhere to look for those. And so, if there's a challenge to San Diego, it may be around diversification, because if we're looking for optical engineers, there aren't that many optical engineering companies in San Diego. So that activity we do largely in the Bay Area. And so in specialty fields, the Bay Area is much more diverse just because of the size and the different types of companies you find there. So we're geographically distributed. About half our employees, plus or minus, are here in San Diego. We have actually 4 facilities in the Bay Area now, partly because of acquisitions, but we're consolidating up there. And then we have major facilities in Singapore and in the UK as well.
Talk a little bit about the culture. That I know from all the conversations we've had over the years that you've just been remarkably successful at maintaining focus and keeping the company on the track that, and you say you told us you do a yearly strategic planning process, which I think is probably quite unusual. Most companies maybe 3 years or 5 years, but not yearly.
Yeah, we do that. It lasts 11 months too, so we have 1 month a year that we're off from strategic planning, and we have a very definitive cycle that goes 11 months of the year and produces a refresh of the 3-year strategic plan. But we have been very thoughtful about our culture. So, in my prior company, we set up a culture that I liked a lot and sort of brought that to Illumina. And we were very specific about trying to define what it was and what the core values of the company were. Probably 2 years after I got here, we articulated those values. Turned out it was sort of too long a list and not memorable. There were 13 of them. They were a little too wordy. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we went in and simplified them and came down to 5 core values. And a lot of what we do, at least for our type of company, is in our passion for creating great products. And so innovation in our DNA sort of stands at the top of the list for us. And that implies that we're willing to focus on taking bigger risks. A lot of public companies get risk averse pretty quickly because they don't want to sort of put the company on the line. And we don't do that. We make risky decisions all the time. And I think when we drop back to our values, that's how we are able to articulate the framework that we use to make those kind of decisions. We don't do science for science sake. So there's a lot of our competitors that were founded by purely scientific CEOs that did a lot of sort of sandboxy research and didn't really focus on getting products to the market. And from day one, our whole passion has been this relentless pursuit of delivering great products. And so that's been fundamental to our culture. And as we've grown, one of the challenges is, how do you maintain that when you go from 25 people to 400 people to 4,000 people. And we've tried really, really hard to build scalable processes that allow us to run it like a big startup. And so we constantly are focused on knocking down bureaucracy. The way we develop products is in small core teams that have a very definitive process to go through, and they only have to report up when things go wrong. And then they have very clear phase gates, and they can go through that process as fast as they possibly can. And we literally write a contract with our development teams. So they come to us and they say, here's what we need to do it, here's what we're going to, and so we need these resources, and then they tell the process managers, here's what we're going to deliver feature-wise, here's what it's going to cost, and here's the time frame. And we literally put signatures on a line and make a commitment to each other to do that. So that means we have to give them the resources. If we do, they promise to deliver us that product per the specs. And then if we go out of bounds on either side, then we have to sit down and have an interim review. If we don't, they can go all the way through the process without us. So it's very scalable in that way.
Looking back, is there anywhere along the way where you think you would have done things any differently than you've done them?
There's probably small things that we would have done differently. I think most of the big decisions that we made, Celexa was one where we almost made the wrong decision. Mm-hmm. We were about to close an acquisition with the company that ultimately became the one that Life Technologies bought to build the solid. But we ran into an intellectual property problem near the end of that caused us to shelf that and go after Celexa instead. So that was one where we kind of escaped what could have been a wrong decision. But I think not a lot of big regrets. I mean, we've had a couple of interesting things that at the time were hard to believe you could actually make this decision, but we paid Affymetrix $90 million to settle a lawsuit for 5 patents that we didn't infringe. So they brought out the big guns, and we were in long-term litigation with them. And we were the little guy, they were the big guy. Our stock price was depressed because of this litigation, and they turned over their CEO, and I was able to negotiate, luckily, a deal where there was a one-time upfront payment and no royalty whatsoever. And they didn't quite realize that their stock price was being held up at that time because we were beating them in the market, but their price was being held up by the fact that the market anticipated we were going to have to pay them a 15% royalty on everything we sold. And so they had this 15% profit built into their income statement on the analysts, and we had the opposite. We had in our projections from the analysts a 15% royalty to Affymetrix. So the day I signed a $90 million check over to them, one-time payment, we exchanged $1 billion in market cap in our favor. Wow. So, but I got to tell you, signing a $90 million check for patents you don't infringe is a tough call.
Wow.
Worth it in the end.
Stop for a second for any questions on this whole area of company culture and building the company.
HLI is a great customer of ours. So they're sequencing lots and lots of genomes. They have a very broad business plan to try to sort of influence the understanding of human health and longevity. Craig's been able to raise a lot of money for HLI, so they have tremendous resources to bring to bear on this. I think the long-term question will be how do they actually wind up monetizing the database that they're building? And I think that's an open question. And there's a lot of elements of their business plan that some might consider speculative in terms of whether they could sell their database the way they propose to. But they're doing great science, and Craig has sort of rebuilt a sequencing pipeline that's pretty impressive. So we do have a very high multiple, and we've maintained that for a long time. We've had bankers come in probably for at least the last 6 years every quarter that draw the charts about how everyone's multiple regresses to the mean, right? And it's just a matter of time. And so you've got to use your capital so I can do an acquisition for you, right? So that's the pitch. And we've been successful in not having regressing to the mean. That's driven by really 2 factors. One is the unbounded market that we've convinced our investors is there, and they've convinced themselves. This isn't snake oil sales by us. This is a gigantic market. The second thing they have to convince themselves of is that we will be able to maintain our pace of innovation. And so far, there's no period where our innovation has slowed down. So in fact, it continues to grow, and we do more things. So I think that is a help to kind of sustaining that multiple. And then the third is you have to keep high growth. And interestingly, we just reported earnings yesterday, and we missed the consensus analyst estimate by 0.4%. But we grew 21% year over year, and our stock got hammered $20 today because of that. So that's what happens in a high multiple stock, right? It happens on the upside, it happens on the downside. And interestingly, in that story, we had an analyst who actually upped his projection after the quarter was over, but before we announced earnings. That caused us to miss the number. So first time we've missed in years. We beat the profit number. To your second question, our model in the clinical market is to take products to IVD, so to get them approved by the FDA and then to sell kits to labs. Because you're right, what we sell broadly to the clinical and diagnostics markets where customers build diagnostic assays on our platform and they run them as LDTs. And so we fuel that ecosystem, and that set of customers are what build our revenue. And so we need to build that and not compete with them. What we will do and do is bring more and more technology into the sequencer. So we build panels that make things easier for customers to build on top of. We'll build products and are building products that we take through the FDA and then sell back to laboratories as kitted products. But we don't want to compete with that clinical infrastructure. We enable these markets as well because sometimes there's not enough money in the marketplace to develop these new applications, so we do a couple things there. We have a very active venture fund where we invest in companies and form strategic partnerships with companies, so we've put about $100 million into various companies, and that's a very active program. And then we also began about 9 months ago an accelerator program. So in our Mission Bay facility, we bring in brand new startups into our accelerator. It's a competitive process, so 40 companies applied for the first round. We pick 3, and then we give them free reagents for 6 months. They can sequence as much as they can sequence in 6 months, and then we kick them out. And so then they either have to get funded or they die, or we might acquire them, I guess, potentially. But it's a way that we can seed these early stage companies that might not have venture for big ideas that might create whole new markets that we can't imagine today. Yeah, it's probably our biggest opportunity and single biggest challenge. So right now, our revenue out of China is about probably 8% of total revenues. It will be our biggest market ultimately. The challenge is, what most of you know, is that doing business in China is difficult. It's difficult structurally. It's difficult from an FCPA perspective. When you go to acquire a company in China, if your strategy is to get into it that way, you typically find 3 sets of books, and you're not sure which one you're looking at. And that's a tough problem with the rigor of the accounting standards that we deal with. You just got to walk away from anything that has any sense that it's not perfectly pure. And there are very few companies in China that meet that standard. So it's hard to get in via acquisition. And then there's the intellectual property challenges there, right? So it's not very well respected in China, and so as a result, we feel some risk in beginning to manufacture there, which it would take to really become a bigger company in China. You need to have a local presence and some local manufacturing, and so that's something we continue to evaluate and try to figure out a way to get to. And so far, we've only taken baby steps where we've partnered with companies that reskin our products, but we don't allow them to get into the guts of the product.
All right, sticking with Stanley already began to take us into the future, as I would expect Stanley to do. Thank you. But we've got this initiative that the president's announced, his precision medicine initiative, right, that involves sequencing, I think, is it 100,000 genomes?
That's 1 million.
A million genomes, okay. The Congress, the House at least, has just taken up the 20th Century Cures Initiative, which will provide additional funding for FDA and additional funding for orphan diseases and fast track. What's Illumina's role going to be in those initiatives?
Well, we hope we're the beneficiary of those initiatives, and we're certainly involved in sort of the backroom discussions about lobbying, trying to get more money for research funding, and we support those efforts. We were directly involved in the president's announcement. I got to go to the White House and sit in the second row when that program was announced, so that was a pretty exciting day for us. They haven't awarded any sequencing yet, so we're not getting any revenue from that, but our hope is that at some point when they actually start doing the sequencing, we'll be a significant beneficiary of that program. But it speaks to the broader evolving market for population sequencing, which is not just going to be US. The first and largest one to date is in the UK, where we're sequencing 100,000 genomes as part of the GEL program. But there's probably 15 other active opportunities around the globe for countries who are thinking about sequencing big parts of their population. And this will really hit an inflection point when the initial projects like GEL begin to show that you can improve treatment, number one, and that you can economically save the healthcare system a lot of money. And once that happens, you're going to see population sequencing explode around the globe, and the program in the US is part of that effort.
So you've taken an hour of your time with us. This has been remarkable. I have one last question. With all the success you've had, the growth of Illumina, what keeps you up at night? Anything?
Well, I sleep pretty well, but there are a lot of things that I worry about and work on. One is sort of the long-range planning for the companies, make sure that strategically we're positioned as well 5 years from now as we are today, and that takes both a lot of work and a lot of vision about what the world's going to look like. And so we spend a tremendous amount of time trying to think about what could the world do to be different 3 to 5 years from now, and how we would be a player under that circumstance, and to what degree we control that outcome. And because if we can control it in a way where it moves the way that advantages Illumina, that's very useful. So we spend a lot of time and energy on that. Certainly the thing I maybe worry about most is sort of control of the growth and the culture of our company. And that has a lot of elements to it. We're going to hire this year 1,200 new people into our company. And that worries the heck out of me, in terms of being able to illuminize that many people in 1 year and to assimilate them. It's a verb, yeah. to bring them into our company, make them effective, and have that not alter our culture in ways that we don't like. So that's something we spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to do better. It has to do with facilities. We have so many facilities around the globe that I can't even keep track of my senior executives. We're never in the same place at once. And so, how we maintain the ability to make decisions quickly, where before you just walk 2 offices down and you can make the call. Now you have to arrange a conference call that might not happen for 3 days because somebody's in a different time zone. And those are things that worry me in terms of how you manage a big company. And this is the first time I've ever done that. I'm sort of a startup guy, at least I used to be, and now I'm managing this big company, and so we're sort of learning as we go.
I remember when Mycogen was acquired by Dow Chemical for the first time in 12 years, I met people who had only one job, and that was to set up meetings for people. And I said, I think it's time to get back into the biotech world.
I was telling Joe that I swore in my whole career I would never work for a company where you required a name badge to get into the company, and I capitulated on that about 6 years ago.
Jay, this has been real enjoyable for me. I know it's been real enjoyable for the audience. It's so informative. Thank you for taking all this time.
My pleasure.
It's really
fun to do.
Thank you.